Okay, so if you've had me already, as we start the Odyssey, you know we actually got into about the first couple books. Here's the deal, though. It's in our textbook, and I've got the link to the textbook, so you can read it if you want. Our textbook really jumps around. I mean, if you look at it, it goes from book 1 to book 5, and I believe it goes to book 9. It is not great the way they do it, so I'm going to do my best to kind of fill you in on everything. So here we go. The Odyssey always starts by the storyteller. In past, it was Homer, would start it the same way. Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer, harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy. I've got another version here, and it starts, Sing in me, O muse, of the man of many troubles, Odysseus, skilled in all ways of contending, who wandered after he helped sack the great city of Troy. Sing through me and tell the story of his suffering, trials, and adventures in his bloody homecoming. Basically, we're asking the muses, the storyteller's asking the muses, who were sort of responsible for inspiration, to tell a good story. So I'm going to ask the muses, let me tell a good story through my computer and reach my students so that they understand what is going on. Essentially, book 1 sets up everything. It's been 20 years since Odysseus has been home. We all know he left for Troy. He won the Trojan War, and then somehow 10 years. What has happened to him those last 10 years? Well, year 20. It opens up with basically Athena saying, enough is enough. She goes to her dad and says, look, this guy's been gone for 20 years. He needs help. There's suitors that are trying to marry his wife. They're trying to kill his kid, and he's stuck with Calypso. So Zeus says, okay, go ahead, help Telemachus. So we all know that the Greeks would be very kind to travelers. Why? Because you never know if it's a god in disguise. So Athena comes down to Ithaca. She pretends or dresses up. She takes the form of a traveler, and she goes to Telemachus, and doesn't say that, hey, your life's in danger, these guys are going to kill you. Says, oh, by the way, I heard your dad is a couple towns over. Why don't you go sail there and check it out? So Telemachus goes in search of his father just before the suitors were going to kill him, so he gets away. Now, obviously for the suitors, they're trying to marry Penelope. It's been 20 years. They want the kingdom. They've been living in his palace, eating his goats and sheep and all that, drinking his wine, and now they want the power. So they know Telemachus is standing in their way, so they want to kill him and they want to marry Penelope. Penelope's been putting him off. She's holding out a grain of hope for her husband to come home. So all we really know in book 1 is that Zeus says, okay, Athena, give him some help. Now I'm going to show you another website that I do have posted a link for you. And it is here. This is the site, GreekGods.org, and I've got you linked to Greek Heroes Odysseus. And it talks about who Odysseus is. It talks about life before the war with Helen being stolen and he saying no and all that kind of stuff. Then you've got the Trojan War, of course, and he's the hero of it. And then look, if you notice, the start of the Odyssey. So for 3 years, he sails around the Sycones, Lotus Eaters, Polyphemus, that's the Cyclops. Winds of the King Aeolus, the Lastrygonians, Circe. Now our book deals with some of this, not with some of it. I'll fill you in. He goes to the underworld, goes to the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the Helios. He goes to all these things, but we haven't seen that yet. It's told in a very weird way. It starts off, he's on the island of Calypso. So for the first 3 years after the Trojan War, he goes through all these trials and tribulations. Then he gets captured. He's stranded on the island of Ogea. Calypso has him hostage for the last 7. So if you count, you got 10 years Trojan War, 3 years of him traveling and going through all these trials of tribulation, 7 years he's been with Calypso. Okay? That's all we know. And that's where the book is going to pick us up, is on Calypso's island. So we know 10 years Trojan War, then we know 3 years, we're not sure what happened. And then we know the 7 years he's with Calypso. And that's when Athena says, come, let him go. So, back to our book. And book 1 is the setup that says a goddess intervenes. So Athena says, enough's enough. I'm saving Telemachus, and I'm going to go make sure Odysseus gets home. So in between there, again, Telemachus gets pushed away, And Zeus and Athena convince Hermes, the messenger god, to go down and tell Calypso enough's enough. You got to let him go. You got to let Odysseus go. And that's where we pick up book 5. If you were with my class, you know that he has been with Calypso. And again, it's the 10th year since he's been gone. For 7 of the 10, he's been with Calypso. And we don't know what happened to those first 3 that he left Troy. So, essentially, Hermes flies down. No words were lost on Hermes the wayfarer, who bent to tie his beautiful sandals on, ambrosial, golden, that carry him over water or over endless land in a swish of the wind, and took the wand with which he charms asleep, or when he wills awake the eyes of men. So wand in hand, he paced into the air, shot from Pieria down to the sea level, and feared to skim the swell. A gull patrolling between the wave crests of the desolate sea will dip to catch a fish and douse his wings. No higher above the whitecaps Hermes flew. Now that right there is called it's a simile, but it's called an epic simile. So it's really making the unfamiliar familiar. So I'm sure many of you have never seen Hermes fly over the water, but I know many of you have seen a seagull patrolling between the wave crests on a sea. So Hermes is flying over the water, and we're supposed to envision a seagull skimming over the water, dipping his wings, and that too is Hermes. I'm going to summarize the rest for you. Essentially, Hermes comes down and says, listen, lady, enough's enough. You gotta let this guy go. Now, at first, Calypso, she's reluctant. She loves Odysseus, doesn't want him to go, and he kind of tricks her. She comes and says, okay, Odysseus, I'm gonna let you go, but you can't be in love with Penelope. I mean, surely I'm immortal. And Odysseus flatters her and says, oh, my wife would never compare to you, but still, I must see my home. So, with Calypso's help, Odysseus builds a raft and sets out to sea. For 17 days, he sails until he is in sight of Scyria. For 3 more days, he's pummeled by storms. He finally makes it ashore. So, he does get ashore. And what happens is essentially King Alcinous, he is welcoming, because after Odysseus leaves Calypso, Poseidon sees him on the sea once more and tries to kill him and doesn't, and he washes up with King Alcinous. And they're having all these games, and they welcome the traveler, and pretty soon they realize, oh my gosh, this is the famous Odysseus. And they say, tell us, Odysseus, it's been 20 years since you left home. Tell us, Odysseus, what happened those last 10? And he kind of says, well, the last 7 I was with Calypso, but those first 3 years after we left Troy, here's what happened. So basically, the first half of the whole story is Odysseus telling King Alcinous, or basically telling us, a flashback. He says, okay, again, Trojan War, first 10 years. Then there's this 3-year period where I'm about to tell you, and then the last 7 I was with Calypso. Finally, the gods intervene. They said, you gotta go. I was on a raft. Poseidon almost got me. That's the chase scene with Poseidon. And I washed up on shore, and here I am. So they say, all right, tell us what happened. And he says, so again, this is the recap. This is what happened once they left Troy. I am Laertes' son. That's his father. What shall I say first? What shall I keep until the end? The gods have tried me in 1,000 ways, but first my name, let that be known to you. And if I pull away from pitiless death, friendship will bind us, though my land lies far away. I am Laertes' son, Odysseus. Men behold me formidable for guile or cunning. In peace and war, this fame has gone abroad to the sky's rim, meaning everybody knows my name. My home is on the peaked sea mark of Ithaca, under Mount Neon's wind-blown robe of leaves, and sight of other islands, and he names several other places. But he says, Ithaca, being most lofty in the coastal sea and northwest, while the rest lie east and south. A rocky isle, but good for a boy's training. I shall not see on earth a place more dear, though I have been detained long by Calypso, 7 years, loveliest among the goddesses, who held me in her smooth caves to be her heart's delight. Just as Circe of Aea, the enchantress, desired me and detained me in her hall. And we'll get to that story. But in my heart I never gave consent. Where shall a man find sweetness to surpass his own home and his parents? In far lands he shall not, though he find a house of gold. Well, basically saying, I've been to all these places, but I still hold Ithaca most dear. So we're continuing on in our book. And so, again, this is a flashback. This is year 20. Once again, 10 years Trojan War, 3 years we're not sure, 7 years Calypso. Then Hermes comes down, sets him free. Poseidon almost kills him, and he washes up on shore of the King Alcinous, and that's when we have our flashback. So what then of my sailing then from Troy? What of those years of rough adventure weathered under Zeus? Odysseus explains that soon after leaving Troy, he and his crew land near Ismarus, the city of the Cicons. The Cicons are allies of the Trojans and therefore enemies of Odysseus. Odysseus and his crew raid the Cicons, robbing and killing them until the Cicon army kills 72 of Odysseus's men and drives the rest out to sea. Delayed by a storm for 2 days, Odysseus and his remaining companions then continue on their journey. All right, so the first spot he goes after leaving Troy was the Cicons. Our book barely touches on that, and then we have the Lotus Eaters. So we go to this new land, and this is not uncommon. When the Greek kings were sailing home, they would stop, they would plunder, they would get rich, so that's what they're doing. So they go into this new land. Those of you that have seen Percy Jackson, this would be about the time I'd show the Lotus Casino, which is the take off of the Lotus Eaters, and those of you might remember that part. So the Lotus Eaters in the Odyssey. I might have made it home safely that time, but as I came round Mount Malea, the current took me out to sea, and from the north a fresh gale drove me on past Cythera. 9 days I drifted on the teeming sea before dangerous high winds. Remember, at this time he's got his whole crew. I think there was, forget what it is, 666 men, or 12 ships, or maybe it was even 1,000 men. There was a lot of people, but slowly but surely over the course of time they dwindled down to just him. So upon the 10th day, Odysseus and his men came to the coastline of the Lotus Eaters, who live upon that flower. We landed there to take on water. All ships' companies mustered alongside for the midday meal. Then I sent out 2 picked men and a runner to learn what race of men the land sustained. Curiosity is a big thing in the Odyssey. You have to live a balanced life. You can be curious, but don't be too curious. So he sends out some men to do some recon. They fell in soon enough with the Lotus Eaters, who showed no will to do us harm, only offering the sweet lotus to our friends. But those who ate this honeyed plant, the lotus, never cared to report nor to return. They longed to stay forever, browsing on that native bloom, forgetful of their homeland. Many think it's the poppy. Many kind of see this as, again, a myth. It's a model and a warning. This is a warning. Too much of a good thing is bad. It's good to lead a balanced life. His men had too much of this flower, too much of this poppy, and they lost their desire to go home. Again, balance. You have to lead a balanced life. Do not overindulge is the lesson here. Also, though, if that's the warning, don't overindulge. There's also a model. Odysseus, like a good leader, leaves no man behind. We see this with him often. So he could have just left, leaving his men behind because they overindulged. But that is not the case. I drove them, all 3, wailing to the ships, tied them down under their rowing benches, and called the rest, all hands aboard! Come, clear the beach, and no one taste the lotus, or you will lose your hope of home. Filling into their places by the rowlocks, my oarsmen dipped their long oars in the surf, and we moved out again on our seafaring. Okay, so that is basically stop number 1. That's where we're going to stop for today. The next one is the Cyclops. This is a real long book, but to recap the important stuff here, it's a flashback. We're learning what happened when he left Troy, and already, boom, the Lotus Eaters. What is this an example of? It's both a model and a warning. The warning, don't overindulge. Lead a balanced life. It's okay to drink or to have food or some of these vices, but don't overdo it. It's not the use, it's the abuse. That's the warning. Remember, myth tells us what's important to a culture, and that is the message. That's the warning. We also have a model of behavior. He could have just left his men, but like a good leader, and we still hold this in high regard in our culture, right? Leave no man behind. That is something that is important, especially in the military in our culture, and it was back in Greek times as well. Odysseus, like a good leader, leaves no man behind. So we've got both a model and a warning here in our example from the Lotus Eaters. So that's where we're going to stop. We will catch you on the next time to see what happens with the Cyclops.